In this lesson, we are going to be creating a mini app that's going to be connecting to a weather forecast endpoint. And there are some limits that we can only do 50 per every 60 minutes. And this is something to keep in mind as you're making connections and also doing some troubleshooting with some of the CORS issues that we might experience when connecting to endpoints. So just using the sample data from the weather API, we're going to loop through the weather API and pick up some of the sample content that we can output onto the page, and then using the data from the page, we're going to display some of that content and provide more options and make additional fetch requests to the endpoints that are coming in from the API itself. So that's all coming up in this lesson. So I've prepared the HTML file, and we've got our basic HTML structure that we've used the same as in the other lessons, and I'm linking to app6.js, cleaned out the JS file, selecting only the elements on the page as objects, and then also adding the button text, and then adding an event listener so when the button is clicked, we get ready in the console. So that means that we're ready to try out some more APIs and connections to the various APIs. So going over to samples.openweathermap.org, we see we get some content being returned here. And it's a little bit hard to read. There's a lot of data here. And this is giving us some sample APIs that we can connect to. So ideally, we want to use this URL and connect to this and output it on the page so that we can easier read the content as an object and then get the contents of that object and make use of it within the web application. So let's make our fetch request and create a function. I'll just call it get values. It's going to require a URL parameter, and I'll just call this URL1 so that we can pass in URL1 into get values. And right now we can use fetch to the URL and making the promise, getting the response, and then returning the response back as response and in JSON structure, then getting the data, and as we get the data back, we want to output the data into the console. So it looks like we've run into a CORS error. We're not able to make the request using the local address. So it's been blocked by the CORS policy. And as we saw in the last lesson, the CORS comes up fairly often. And this is something that you can't control because it's at the endpoint. And it's some of the restrictions that are added in from the endpoint. So let's try it with the CORS anywhere and add that in. I'll just call this URL2, and this is where the CORS anywhere can be located, and then add in, and we'll concatenate the two URLs together and see what happens now. So now we made the request and we were able to access the endpoint. So on this particular openweathermap.org, if you do want to do some testing from local, then you should be using the CORS anywhere, which gives you access to the API. So now we're able to return the content, and we've got the products listing, so samples, so the name is samples, and we've got the various products, and then documentation on these products. So docs, and then it's got a number of sample arrays. So if we want to get the forecast for 5 days, let's see if we can access that data within the products. And I'm going to just do that within the console, and as we click it, we're going to build down until we get to the content that we want to loop through, that we want to iterate through. So forecast for 5 days, take that property name, and under products, forecast 5 days is the property name that we want to access. And then within the samples, this is where we've got access to the sample URLs. So that means that we're ready to loop through that. And let's create another function that we can handle the making of it. So just give it a name of data, and we'll console log the data object out. And then from the function, then at that point, then we can start to look to see the content and output it on the page. So we've made the console data and getting the content, and now we can take data samples and loop through for each and return back the element. And let's log out each one of the elements that are contained within this object. And so what it has is it's got just URLs, and then these URLs are returning back additional data. So we want to make requests to the URLs and output the results into our web page. So these are just different endpoints that we can make fetch requests to. And let's also take a look at what we've got at docs. And we'll output the data docs. And that as well is going to be a document URL that if we open that up, it provides us some additional details that we can get and we can make the requests to. So this is just documentation on the Open Weather API. And this is another one of those where you are going to need to have an API key to work fully within the web application, within the API to make proper calls. It gives you some information about the required fields. So the query is required, the app ID is required. And here they've got a sample app ID and also a query for it. So an ID and an app ID for the forecast. So those are the required fields. And JSON in this case is a default, and that's why we're seeing the content being sent back in JSON. So what we want to do is, as we iterate through, we want to make another fetch request to that content. So function get more, and this is going to be as well passing in a URL. And from here we're going to make a fetch request. So we can comment the structure for the fetch request. And in this case, we'll do a console log of the data. And as we loop through, and again, we've run into the CORS error. So let's solve that by doing the same thing that we did before, where we're going to be appending the URL to the URL2. So making a fetch request to URL2, and so that way we can make the fetch requests. In here we've got the city information. So once we get the response information back, we can output this content onto the page within the output area. So let's finalize that, where as we loop through, we've got these new objects, and from these objects we want to output the page content. So the name, the county, and the coordinates of that location. So function, and let me just double check and make sure I didn't use adder already. And this will just get data, and from here we'll just console log out the data that we've got to work with. And instead of logging it out, we'll log it out to the adder. And I'll get rid of some of the excess console messages, so that we're only getting the final data that we actually want to output and use on the page. It looks like one of them isn't structured properly. That's where it looks like we're throwing an error there. So we're just going to ignore that. And if you were creating the application, then you would want to be using an actual API key and then making the connection to get the proper data. And if you do have any types of issues like this, then you'd have to troubleshoot it and find out why there's a JSON error. And this is a JSON structure error. So that's what we've encountered before as well. So once we're outputting the data, let's first put the city and create the city contents with the coordinates. So constructing and creating a main parent div using the document, create element, and the element that we're creating is going to be a div, and then using output and append the div to the output. And within the div, the inner HTML and template literals, so those are the backticks. Let's select the data for the city information, and I'll create another object that's going to reference the data and city. So it's just easier when I'm coding to access that information. So for the city, and use the curly brackets, city, and I'm trying to output the city, and under city we've got a name. And we can also add in the country code. So that's under country. So city, country. We can also go deeper and get the coordinates. So that's city, and that's an object within. So get the coordinates, and within here there's a latitude and longitude. So lat and longitude. So that outputs that information onto the page. So it's throwing an error that there's been too many requests from the Heroku app endpoint, and doesn't look like I'm able to get any additional information. So this is essentially what you can do, and it is a really good practice API, and this is one of the disadvantages of actually just using the practice API, where we're not able to make as many requests as we want. And COURS is actually one of the most common questions that I get when making requests to various endpoints. So if you do want to find out more information about how COURS works, it's short for cross-origin resource sharing. There's more information at the Mozilla Developer Network. And basically it's a header-based mechanism that allows you to indicate any other origins from the domain name. So it allows us to do a cross-origin request, and it's served from this, uses the XML HTTP request object to request to this endpoint. And for security reasons, there are restrictions from browsers for cross-origin requests. So this is, again, sitting on the server, depending on what their headers are set to. And in this case, what we saw is that there are certain limits to making requests from certain endpoints, from certain websites. So there are some limitations to how many requests can be made. And there's more information about how the COURS will work. And when we are making the request, essentially we're making the request from the client going over to the server. So the web application is acting the same way as a web browser, where we're going over to the website and we're getting the content that the server is providing at that particular web point. And this is also a common security feature for the post requests, which we are going to be looking at in more detail later on. There's a number of other additional proxies that you can use in order to make the requests, or you can upload it to a website, and that will change where the client side is making the request to the endpoint, and that will also provide you some more options in order to make those requests. Challenge for this lesson is to connect to the endpoint. Also try, when you're developing locally, to try out with proxy in order to connect to the endpoint so it's not coming from a local machine, and then output the JSON data onto the web page.